Hey everyone, welcome to the Current Case Podcast. We're a group of 4 friends discussing the latest current events as they apply to our everyday lives. From foreign policy to local events, we cover it all as best we can in a manner not restrained by the bias of the big media corporations. We may not always agree with each other on certain topics, but that is what makes it all the more interesting. Being able to sit down and have a civil conversation on even the most controversial topics is a necessity for a better society.
Everybody, and welcome back to the Current Case Podcast. Please remember to subscribe, leave a like, and also check out our Spotify as well. Also hit the bell icon to be notified for upcoming videos and alerts and any other channel updates. So today is February 15th, Wednesday. A couple of different things we're going to be talking about today. First, something big that's been happening the past couple of weeks in our home state in East Palestine, Ohio. So on February 3rd, we had a freight train that derailed in East Palestine. That's right by the border of Pennsylvania. It was carrying 20 cars of highly flammable toxic chemicals, and this ignited a fire that was a quarter-mile long that burned for days on end. On February 6th, the officials with the Ohio National Guard and the U.S. Department of Defense had announced, or they were worried that the tankers hadn't already combusted, and they instituted a vent and burn operation, which was a controlled ignition. They claimed would allow the chemicals to safely dissipate. About 1,500 people have been evacuated after the derailment, and now within the past couple of days, they are saying they can come back. I've heard that some residents are kind of terrified of coming back. They're very unsure about returning back to their homes. So a few did, but people that actually did return have been reporting burning sensations in their throat and eyes. There's been various layers of soot in the creeks in their cars, and they've also noticed that there's been dead animals as well, including chickens, fish, and even pets. So this is a really big environmental disaster. Honestly, I can make the comparison. This is like our own mini Chernobyl right now, because this hasn't been covered too much by the mainstream media. Of course, I think it's all over, like more local. It's been circling around the internet for sure, but in terms of like the big mainstream media covering it, I haven't seen too much on it, to be honest. I think now it's starting to pick up a little bit more steam, but especially when it happened, you barely heard anything about it. So this is, of course, going to have devastating effects, or already has had devastating effects on that community, and of course the communities surrounding it as well. So big question is, who's at fault here? What's going to happen? I mean, what's the whole outcome of this situation going to be? What are the effects of this going to be from here on out? What could have been done differently? So here we can start with that, start discussing and see what's going to happen from there.
Yeah, as you said, Jared, I don't know why in the first place you would have 18 cars full of vinyl chloride, but, railroad for you. We'll just start off kind of by talking about what vinyl chloride is and kind of set the record straight for all the information going out there. At room temperature, vinyl chloride is a colorless, highly flammable, and potentially explosive gas. Inhalation is the primary route of exposure, and it is readily absorbed from the lungs. According to the CDC, vinyl chloride is treated as a human carcinogen, which is wonderful. And when vinyl chloride is heated or burned, it tends to self-polymerize. And if it's burned, it can turn into phosphine gas, which can cause acid rain. Now, the primary target of vinyl chloride exposure is the central nervous system. So people may experience things like dizziness, ataxia, inebriation, fatigue, numbness, tingling of the extremities, visual disturbances, coma, and death. Vinyl chloride can irritate the eyes, mucous membranes, and respiratory tract. And the way this works is vinyl chloride is thought to suppress the central nervous system via a solvent effect on lipids and protein components of neural membranes that interrupts signal transmission. So what happens is, if you inhale vinyl chloride, it goes to your CNS and gets absorbed into your fat and your muscle, and it interrupts the way your nerves fire. There may be a latent period of hours to days between exposure and symptom onset. So just because you were exposed to it on Monday, it may take until Wednesday or Thursday to kind of feel it. With inhalation exposure, signs and symptoms increase in severity over a range of 8,000 to 20,000 parts per million in the air. Now, I don't know how much vinyl chloride actually got out, because it sounds like a lot of it immediately started burning and turning into phosphine gas. So I'm going to transfer over to that segment. But vinyl chloride has caused angiosarcoma in the liver of heavily exposed individuals.
So phosphine used, of course, when burned. A chemistry professor, Niall Donahue, backed it up, used in World War I as a chemical weapon. When it's burned, vinyl chloride also becomes hydrogen chloride gas as well. Of course, causes all those symptoms. So essentially, breathe that in. It's like breathing in a gas attack in a trench in World War One.
Yeah, this stuff is really not good. I know you mentioned before people were scared to go back home in that area. They should be. I'd argue we all probably ought to be a little bit scared because this stuff is like one of the worst carcinogens known to man, and they just burned it off willy-nilly. You can always trust the government to do the quote-unquote right thing. So yeah, I've heard reports that Philadelphia's experiencing some acid rain as a result of this. Stuff's killing chickens in people's backyards, which is real interesting when you look at how people were noticing and getting mad about the price of eggs going up, so more people are buying chickens, but then we have a bunch of chickens dying because of this chemical in this prime farmland. It's getting in the crops, I would assume, because of the acid rain and all that. Getting into the water probably will have a negative impact on the fish population.
Does it affect the trout population?
And it's also getting into the Ohio River, which they say that the tests have not found any contamination. I don't know if I believe that. I don't believe everything the government says, but they've said that it hasn't been contaminated. But if it has been, then that's a big problem because the Ohio River either intersects or connects to every other major river in this country.
Right. I know they actually underreported on the amount of chemicals in the train in the first place. So I think this is a big government screw up from top to bottom. I mean, this goes back with that rail strike we were talking about back in season 1, and that happened during the fall, November time. Of course, Biden and the federal government ended up shutting down that rail strike, essentially saying, hey, you cannot go on strike because we have control over interstate commerce and back to work or you're fired, basically. And what were they striking over?
Fuck you, we're fired.
I know. They literally should have. And what were they striking over? For better working conditions, better hours, and sick days as well. So I think they got, I'm trying to recall what they actually got from that deal. Not much, I'll say that. I think they got maybe a couple more sick days.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah.
Like a couple extra sick days. You can always count on the government to do the right thing.
So it's like, yeah, and I'm going to criticize Biden heavily for this. It's like you're supposed to be a big union guy. Democrats tend to lean more towards the union, and they force them back to work. And look what happens. Because of these unsafe conditions, probably overstressed rail workers, this accident happens and it's impacting all of us.
Yeah. So, yeah, all this phosgene gas, right, that's what gets emitted when those rail cars burn. It is very corrosive. It's freely soluble in most liquid hydrocarbons, benzene, etc. It first gained reputation worldwide in World War I, as you know, Jared, where it was used in chemical warfare. The problem with phosgene is it's a lung toxicant that causes damage to the capillaries, alveoli, and other parts of the lung by decomposition to hydrochloric acid. This can cause pulmonary edema, bronchopneumonia, and can occasionally cause lung abscesses also. They've also noted degenerative changes in the nerves as later developments, and a concentration of just 25 parts per million is dangerous for exposures lasting 30 to 60 minutes, and at 50 parts per million is rapidly fatal even after short exposure. That source is from the EPA itself back in 1998. So if you have 18 rail cars spewing out this phosgene gas, I'm sure that it's getting above 50 parts per million within that evacuation zone.
Yeah, more than likely. And what do you guys think of Governor DeWine's response to the issue? He hasn't said too much, honestly. That's the thing. Like, he never issued a state of emergency, which would have allowed more federal funding to go into the place in the first place. So that could be another reason why it wasn't highlighted in the media, because I think he probably should have issued a state of emergency for what happened there, but he didn't for some reason.
The only things further than I'm reading is firefighting. It says, in case of fire, if tank rail or a tank truck is involved, isolate for 1,600 meters, 1 mile in all directions. Also consider initial evacuation for a mile in all directions.
Mm-hmm.
It sounds like that's something they did, but sodium hydroxide or anhydrous ammonia have been used to neutralize phosgene. Mm-hmm. So hopefully they can get that out of the water supply But at the same time, sodium hydroxide and anhydrous ammonia are what? They're strong bases, right? So you'll mess with the pH of the water as well, trying to neutralize it.
I think another thing that kind of contributed to the underreporting of this is that it pretty much happened out in the middle of what's essentially a relatively isolated farming community. Had this happened, say, in or near Columbus or Cincinnati, I guarantee you it would have been front page news across the nation.
That's true. I mean, I'm sure the population had an effect as well.
Well, that, and I think most of the mainstream media have, I guess in their opinion, bigger fish to fry.
That's the thing, though. This is definitely, this is a pretty big thing to look at. And, it has, and it is having negative effects on our environment currently right now, too. I don't know why there hasn't been attention or enough attention brought to it by our government. I think at this point, a lot of people have brought it to our attention, but the government, they haven't done much to respond to it, or done enough, you should say, to actually respond to it. In fact, a journalist was actually arrested on February 8th when he was covering it. He was broadcasting live when Governor DeWine was giving a press conference, and he was arrested by an officer for being too loud, apparently. It's always a couple hours later, though, so.
Well, isn't that convenient? Always count on the government to do the right thing.
No.
Do you think this is going to end up like Flint, Michigan? If you look at Flint, Michigan, they still don't have clean drinking water there.
So here's what I'm reading about that from the CDC. Phosgene can be released into indoor air as a gas or outside. Phosgene is unlikely to contaminate water because it breaks down rapidly upon contact to produce hydrochloric acid and carbon dioxide. Phosgene is unlikely to contaminate food because it breaks down rapidly upon contact in the same way. And the agricultural implications are also somewhat negligible. It says if phosgene is released as a gas, it is highly unlikely to contaminate agricultural products. Again, this is from the CDC, so I would hope that the information here is correct, but I think it just highlights a bigger issue that, let's say the stuff was soluble in farmland. What would have just happened if we could not filter that out of the water? If that would, go into our groundwater, that would go into the crops around here. So that would go down the Ohio River and into the Mississippi. And the Mississippi is believed the number 1 source of water for America's crops. People out in Nebraska, Kansas, they get all that, everything in the plains to, where'd you classify Ohio as?
What do you mean? Like geographically?
Mm-hmm. Like Midwest?
Yeah, Midwest region.
Yeah.
Side note, I think I'd classify Ohio as Mid-East. It's in the Midwest, technically, but we have nothing in common with people from, Montana,
Yeah, but that's the point. It's like, if we're in the Mid-East and this happens, and it gets to the Mississippi, then it's also going to affect the Midwest, and that's where most of our food supply comes from. So fortunately, I think the worst aspect about this is going to be acid rain, because we've seen that, but
yeah,
talk about dodging a bullet.
I assume you guys have seen the photos and videos of the controlled burning right after the accident and everything.
Yeah.
Looks like absolutely horrible over there. It's just kind of shocking to see, honestly. But yet, not enough attention brought to it.
Yeah. I guess it really goes to show the kind of state of our society when the media is all too happy to report. I don't know, give me an example.
I remember Floyd and then COVID. When Floyd protests were happening, it was like COVID didn't exist for a couple months.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, media is all too happy to report about that, but conveniently sweeps genuine issues under the rug.
Exactly.
Now, an important point I would like to bring up with this whole train derailment. It stems from such a variety of issues Jared talked about, right?
Yeah.
If the workers had shown just a little bit more testicular fortitude, and just been like, no, Congress, we're still going to stand up to this. There are too many issues in the railroad that need to be addressed. Still, something like this may not have happened. Now, I know that's kind of a long stretch because they might have just tried to hire on other people, but where are you going to find an entirely new railroad workforce? No one particularly wants to go into the railroad because of these working conditions. It would have just gone to a screeching halt.
Yeah, and at that point, they would have been forced to do something because it severely impacts the economy. So the government would have been forced to make some type of change.
But what I'm so intrigued by is the fact that the left and the left side of the media is completely silent on this. As Jared pointed out earlier, you would think that something involving, big business, corporate greed, and a huge environmental disaster would be front page news everywhere. But it's basically radio silence on it.
Which party's in charge right now? There you go. That's your answer.
Yeah, I mean, the only real major news media outlet I've seen cover this, other than like local ones, I'm talking like major nationwide ones, is Fox News. And, you know, everybody knows that they have kind of a conservative slant. Some might argue they have a pretty heavy conservative bias. And because of this, there's a sizable portion of people who just don't trust anything they say. It's kind of like how a lot of conservatives don't trust anything CNN says because they have that liberal slant to them. So when you have one politicized major news media outlet covering this and half the country is just like disregarding everything they say, obviously that's going to lead to some stuff like this where, you know, they're just not talking about it at all, even though it seems like the kind of thing they should be talking about.
Reminds me of the old joke about the Soviet Union's media groups back in the day, and how there was two of them, Pravda and Izvestia, news and truth, and that in the news there is no truth, and in the truth there is no news.
Right. That's why I'm also calling this a mini Chernobyl incident, basically. Obviously not as severe on the wide scale, but just in comparison to the environmental disaster and the government trying to sweep this under the rug, I think you can make a couple clean comparisons there.
All we can really hope for at this point is that this whole thing can be resolved as soon as possible.
Well, by resolve, how would you resolve it? I mean, there's no real way to filter this out. You have to wait it and let it pass.
Keep it contained as best as possible. Do whatever cleanup you can. Do it.
Did you see they only paid out, what was it, $5 per person within that town of like Palestine for the whole incident? It's like, oh yeah, here's $5 for your trouble. Like, you know, go piss off.
What good will $5 do you anyway in this day and age?
Yeah,
exactly.
I mean, I feel like everyone there should get at least $15,000 for their house, everything else.
Yeah, here's Norfolk Southern's full comprehensive remediation plan. So they're monitoring air and water. They're working with the EPA to install more air quality monitors inside homes so to alert residents for any danger. They also sent a notice of potential liability. So as you said, they're going to pay just $25,000 to the town, $5 per resident, and they've upgraded that since. Okay, so they have upgraded that since to $1,000 per resident in the evacuation zone. They're reimbursing residents over $1.2 million for housing, transportation, and meal expenses incurred by the relocation. But people do claim that they've been affected in a much larger area, so various lawsuits have been filed against them in an attempt to broaden monitoring and potential medical treatment of people living within a 30-mile radius of the zone.
Even so, where do you think all that phosgene gas is going to go? It's going to go east. It's going to go over Pittsburgh. It very well may make its way to New York, depending on the winds and how fast it decomposes in the atmosphere. Is Norfolk Southern going to reimburse me if my paint on my car is destroyed because of the acid rain? Are they going to reimburse me since I just put a new roof on my house if acid rain destroys my shingles? Are they going to do any of that? Or am I going to have to pay for a new roof if we get more acid rain? You know, it's probably disgusting trying to give people, you know, like $5, even $1,000. Like, that's criminally unjust.
And $5, that was a joke.
Yeah.
They probably got so much flack for that. That's why they're like, oh, okay, let's do $1,000. That's ridiculous. I mean, there are probably going to be a lot of lawsuits filed against them. Mm-hmm. People report, hey, as you said, damage to my structure outside the zone. See you in court. So we'll see how this gets settled because there's probably going to be a lot of cases within the upcoming months of damage to property.
Oh, definitely. And if they like, oh, well, we're going to have to go bankrupt. Well, that sucks. That's capitalism. You fuck up, well, guess what? You're going out of business. Yep. Sucks.
Sorry.
And then maybe we can get a new company in there who treats their employees properly and actually upholds safety standards.
That's a lot to ask for, unfortunately, at the moment.
But it shouldn't be a lot to ask for. I mean, would the French let this slide? What would the French have to say about this? If it happened in their country, they'd be all over this. They wouldn't stand for it.
The other thing is, like, I don't think it's being conveyed on the other side of the screen to everyone listening to this just how pissed off we are at the whole situation. Like, yes, we're talking about it in a relatively chill manner, but just the disgust and outrage that everyone feels over this entire event cannot be overstated.
Oh, I'm furious about it. I mean, you can attest to that. When I was talking to you about it before we even started recording, I'm not happy about this at all.
Slamming my fist.
I think the government sucks.
Ashton, what about you?
It's certainly something that never really should have happened in the first place. And if they're really going to stoop to this poor level of damage control, their ship definitely deserves to sink.
100% there. Again, is this going to inspire change? Probably not. It'll probably be swept under the rug, forgotten about, or I hope we'll forget about it within the next couple of weeks and move on till the next accident, basically, is my prediction.
Here's a question. I know a lot of people on social media have been pointing this out, but with everything else that's going on in the world,
Yep.
as they're getting ready to apparently release the Epstein list. They're just like distraction. There's a whole bunch of like major things kicking off. Has that list come out, Jared? Have you heard anything about it?
Oh,
Nope.
It would be all over the place if something did come out like that.
So apparently they've been holding stuff on C-SPAN, but it's been awfully quiet.
Yeah, I haven't heard anything at all, so no buzz or anything, so not yet at least.
What the hell are you guys waiting for? Get on with it.
Right. Speaking of stuff that's been kind of covering the media, I do think it's somewhat worth talking about because we were kind of on it this past weekend with all the objects being shot down over various airspaces.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
The objects.
And it was like Saturday, we were like, what? We just saw on Twitter, like, various, like, airspaces were closing. We're like, what's going on? No communication at all. And it came, I think the FDA was like, we're going to wait till morning to deal with this. I forget where even was that airfield?
That was the one over Montana.
Yeah, Montana.
Then it eventually appeared up again over Lake Huron.
That's right, and that was shot down, I think, Sunday.
Mm-hmm.
So it's been quiet since Sunday. I haven't heard more about objects, at least in our own airspace and Canada's airspace. But, of course, we also haven't heard much about these objects either that they shot down. There's really no... They have their own theories, but they haven't come out with anything concrete. They haven't really said what they are exactly. And the White House said it could be commercial, so privately owned, possibly. But if it is, though, then what is it?
Well, you gotta love the government shooting down stuff that they can't even, allegedly, they can't even identify in commercial airspace. I mean,
Right.
what are they doing? It doesn't make any sense. They did say that it's not extraterrestrial.
Yeah, they did.
I'm not convinced of that necessarily, but they say it's not extraterrestrial, but they also say they can't identify it, so we don't really know what these things are. They're just shooting stuff down in commercial airspace willy-nilly like it's nothing, and they shouldn't be doing that, in my opinion, if they can't identify it.
Well, the leading theories are that they think there's some sort of drone from Russia or China. So I think there was one balloon, and now they're getting a little bit more brazen, and they're testing different types of drones. So, Ashton, if you want to talk about that a little bit more in depth, go ahead.
Yeah. I know that drones, I think, are probably the most likely thing, in my opinion. And if they were genuinely from either China or Russia, it would explain their shoot downs and the airspace closures.
Yeah.
Though, wasn't there a report saying that one of them was like circular or octagonal shape?
Yeah, there was. I think it was the one over Huron.
Though, allow me to provide something interesting. There's actually been an aircraft back in the 50s that was shaped like a flying saucer. You can actually see an example in the Air Force Museum's experimental gallery. Mm-hmm. Of course, back then, that project couldn't get more than a few feet off the ground or travel faster than 35 miles an hour and was thus scrapped.
Right.
Though part of me is curious if maybe with like today's modern technology, fly-by-wire and computer-generated airframe designs, if that something like that project might be revived in the modern day. And that's one possibility as to explain these things.
Saying not aliens.
Yeah, the White House 19 hours ago told governors thousands of objects in the skies aren't aliens and could be used car lot balloons.
Car lot balloons?
Yep.
Shouldn't we know that before we shoot them down?
Yeah.
That doesn't make sense.
These jets could probably pull up next to them and be like, oh, why does it say sail on it? Interesting.
That doesn't make sense.
Huge. Blowout sailing.
Yeah.
So strange.
This is weird. It's like, if they're privately owned, how are we not able to identify it?
Well, either whoever owns these things is being negligent or is...
trolling?
I don't know, really.
I mean, definitely the balloon was China's. Obviously, they claimed it as theirs. Maybe we're paranoid about stuff in the air, like random objects in the airspace. I mean, how often does this happen, basically? Is this just making the headlines because of after what happened with the China balloon?
More than likely.
Balloon?
Possibly, yeah.
Something else I heard is that we kind of freaked out over the fact that we had the spy balloon coming into our airspace, and it was only noticed because someone saw it flying overhead. And so NORAD changed the search pattern and intensity of their radar stations. And so now we're doing apparently a different sweep pattern with different altitude targeting as well. And so now that we've changed our radar scanning, more objects are popping up that previously we may not have been seeing.
That could definitely be concerning if these are indeed some new type of Chinese or Russian drone.
Yeah, and that's what people are concerned about, is they're definitely Chinese or Russian. And because of the administration we have, they're just becoming more bold and embracened and just keep flying over and testing the water. So that's my leading theory, and I think it's the most plausible, especially with just earlier today, that not necessarily incursion, but the spotting of those Russian fighters and bombers off the Alaskan
that stuff happens pretty much every month.
Yeah,
I was going to say,
I was about to, because I saw that pop up, and I was like, huh, but I was like,
it happens so frequently. Yeah. They fly next to our airspace. We send up our Vipers, kind of like wave and go do their thing.
If they flew into our airspace, that'd be a little bit different.
Well, technically, Tupolev 95 doesn't need to fly into U.S. airspace to launch a strike with a cruise missile, because those things can easily reach as far as from Kamchatka all the way up to Anchorage.
Right. It's like, I mean, you see those stuff, you kind of just let them past. It's like you see Chinese incursions into Taiwanese airspace. That happens all the time as well. So I've let those pass. But Matt, so you're saying you don't buy the fact that the White House Biden administration is saying that they're probably commercial?
No, I highly doubt it.
Yeah. One of the senators actually said, Tom Tillis, he said, or questioned that theory, because he was like, if they are privately owned, why didn't the company come forward to claim the objects?
Yeah, now,
which no one
I could see why they try and put that spin out there. Because we don't necessarily want China or Russia to know that we've seen their drones, we've shot them down, we now know about them. So the more we can kind of keep them in the dark, the better for our intelligence.
I mean, when they see that through they see our media headlines though, we'd be shot down. So
well, it's one thing for media to report it, it's another thing for the government to officially come out and claim something. They do have different connotations.
Yeah, I kind of see that point, especially when the media these days is so polarizing. It's hard to tell what's true and what's just a bunch of bullshit, for lack of better words. Though I, for one, think it's time to stop playing nice with Russia and China.
Yeah, but something far more concerning. Have you guys seen the Marburg disease?
What? I have. I've heard it's basically the spread of it. It's like Ebola, where you have to be like exposed to someone's blood, like fluids. Mm-hmm. I'm more concerned with disease-wise. We're talking like pandemics. I'd be more concerned with avian flu. That the risk of that jumping to people. Like Marburg's, it's definitely scary, but with a fatality rate so high, it's hard to spread. And I think it'd be contained pretty easily.
Yeah, not to mention, you can protect yourself from bodily fluids relatively easily.
Yeah.
Just need to keep clean.
As long as you're not in a major city like New York or LA, where people are urinating and shooting up heroin everywhere. But yeah, outside of those cities, you should be fine.
We've had Ebola outbreaks before. It's not the first time. Probably the most comparable thing, and usually you can tell when someone has it, because they go downhill fast and you can contain them.
And the other thing is you don't have an entire nation pretending that it doesn't exist. It just keeps getting out of hand.
Yeah.
China.
Right. Avian flu, in terms of possible pandemics, that's what I'm a lot more keeping an eye on, I'd say, more concerned with. Because there's been a lot of stuff popping up with a lot of mammals dying, and actually mass numbers here pretty recently, and all types of mammals too. So the concern is if it jumps the mammal to mammal, then how soon does it jump to humans? All right, so coming back to the objects here, I like connecting these two stories together with what happened with the derailment and the UFO story, because obviously this UFO story has been the one taking the main headlines this past weekend, especially. They are not doing enough to communicate. Tell us what's going on. I'm seeing it through just various headlines, what senators have to say, but they've not come out and actually sat down to tell the media, tell us what's happening, what these objects are. Say you don't know, possibly. We're still working to identify them and tell us what's going to happen, basically.
Keep us in the loop and keep us updated on when something new is discovered.
Exactly.
Do we not have the right to be informed about something like this?
That's what I was about to say. We absolutely, we deserve to know. We have a right to know. Mm-hmm. They need to stop hiding stuff from us.
They do, and it's absolutely ridiculous that they're not properly communicating.
Yeah, and if they're not properly communicating out of fears that it might anger China or whoever else is responsible for sending these objects into our airspace, I think we're past the point where we can appease China, because appeasement doesn't work when you're that just doesn't work when it comes to dictators. You don't force regime change by allowing it to be stable.
Right.
Yeah, and I mean, you can even compare the way our government and media have been handling this to how those totalitarian regimes have been handling other stuff, like what kind of government hides stuff from their people? I mean, you can argue they all do, but let's look at the traditional examples of governments that do this, most notably China, Russia, North Korea, totalitarian states like that. So, you kind of have this expectation that America is supposed to do better and be better. But from what we can see, they haven't been.
No, they haven't, but we're still trying to. I mean, Russia at this point we've completely blocked out, but China, we're trying still. I haven't heard much, China said they're going to do something since we shot down their balloon.
Yeah, and I know they've recently been accusing us of sending a balloon close to their territory. I mean, do you not think turnabout is fair play, China, if that is the case? Or is this a false flag operation just so you can basically pin the blame on us for something you do?
It's a joke so far.
Sounds like the playbook of the Democrats, too, honestly.
Yeah, it does. A little bit. Honestly, I'd say it's all parties at this point.
Time to purge Capitol Hill and this government. Certainly needs it.
It needs a good squeeze. Get rid of them all, dump them all out. They're all incompetent. I know we mentioned this already, just to prove more government incompetence. It's like this, the state of our economy, inflation still is not shrinking. In fact, it's gone up. Actually, this past month, the debt default that they're still open to. It's like, come on, guys. Wow, enough's enough. This is getting ridiculous at this point. I'm losing my faith, Cameron. God damn it. What do I do now?
To be honest, I've already lost my faith.
Well,
I'm a sovereign citizen.
I mean, always do what the French do.
It's like these things. So I do want to state, it's like these things can be difficult to talk about because we do have to watch, of course, what we say. But it's hard to talk about, just the state of things at the moment without getting so depressed.
Yeah, and one really has to ask the question, when is enough enough?
Right. It's like we were pretty frustrated or angry talking about that derailment story, and then just kind of frustrated with the lack of communications about these UFOs and stuff.
But you guys notice how people, I'm talking whole populations, cities, nationwide, they only really get pissed off at something if the media is the one telling them to get pissed off at it. Unless mainstream media is expressly saying, you should be mad at this, this is an outrage, this is that. No one particularly cares about anything. And that's part of the problem. You don't have the media really criticizing what Biden's doing or what Congress is doing or the train derailment or the UFOs. It's all whatever. They might cover it in one news segment and that's it.
Right.
But when you have news stories, because we've all seen this go on for months at a time over seemingly trivial occurrences, and it just gets everyone riled up. When we have major things, where's everyone? Where's the outrage? Why aren't you, going out there and protesting and demanding change? Everything is oddly quiet and no one particularly seems to care or pay attention to it.
It seems they don't care about anything unless it seems to directly affect them.
Yeah, because they're all NPCs. The media didn't tell me to do this, so I don't care.
It's hard to think for yourself, that's for sure. You're getting fed whatever from TikTok, the media, all that stuff. So it's there's always good examples of that. I'm always highly critical of Trump's time in office too, but you saw it easily that the media was pretty much biased against Trump, especially 2020 Floyd protests. I mean, media was only covering that instead of COVID, which was still a new pandemic at the time. And then when election season rolled around, October, November, all of a sudden COVID just became a major issue again. So the media kind of covers the stories that they want the people, as Matt said, to hear. Then any stories that affect whatever agenda they have, we're going to push that one to the side.
It's really a tricky situation with media companies, right? They're all owned by the same people, but let's just deconstruct the entire media franchise. You have two options. You can either have government-controlled media or you can have private companies issuing media. What are the pros and cons of each? If you have government-issued media, well, that just sounds like a propaganda channel. And if you have privately owned media, you might lack credibility in certain aspects. There's really no such thing as common ground in that instance. You can't have both government-controlled media and freedom of the press. But then the fact remains as well, if you are independent and you're trying to create media, how are you going to be able to do it? You have to continually sensationalize your news, because across all media channels, yours has to be the one that gets there first. You have to be the one to have like the craziest headlines. You have to have the one with the most interesting and hyped up stories. Nowhere do you have, I wouldn't say even unbiased news, just you don't have a place where you can just sit there and be like, all right, here's the news for the week, kind of take it, and then go on with your day.
Mm-hmm.
There's no context for you to form your opinions on. That's another problem.
I'd say the 24, my parents always point this out. I mean, I actually do agree with them on this. Like the 24-hour news cycle has been, I think, what's been the big symptom of this all. Because, I mean, they're always looking for something to cover.
Yeah, like some days you could quite literally be, we have no news to report. And just leave it at that. Not everything has to be sensationalized. You don't have to talk about like some pet dog over in Nebraska battling leukemia. Like, you know, nothing has to be that deep.
Right.
Sometimes it's best just to be like, you know what, everything's okay for right now, don't worry about it.
If you really want to, you can at least have a weather report for the day or next couple of days and leave it at that.
Speaking of, something for next week I may want to discuss here. I mean, just how weird our weather's been recently. Like, it's 70 degrees and it's February 15th. Like, it's nice, but that's not normal. Like, I want to see if my brother wants to come on and possibly talk about the environment and climate change and all that, state our thoughts.
Climate change real?
We'll see. Let's see what he has to say, because he's the meteorologist. So
Yes, it's real, but we are not, America is not contributing to it as much as people like to believe. It's real, it's happening, but we're not the ones causing it. Like, it's going to happen regardless. We might be accelerating it, but it's still going to happen. And if you really want to blame somebody, blame countries like China that are going through an industrial revolution right now, instead of blaming us for using plastic straws.
I'm going to say this in a way that doesn't get us canceled, nor land us in hot water. I don't necessarily believe that humans are the sole contributor for climate change. I will elaborate on that when your brother comes on, and we can have a discussion about it.
Okay.
Not that I don't believe in it, not that all the scientists are wrong. I would like to open up a dialogue and kind of learn more about it.
Yeah.
And talk about some other interesting points that may not be reflected as often in the mainstream media platform. Because they really like pushing the whole like green energy bit, because they get paid to. The corporations who make solar panels, EVs, they want all that stuff advertised.
Right.
So like it fits their narrative. I like to talk about a couple other possible causes.
Try to get him on here. All right, but I guess with that being said, I think it's time to wrap things up for today. Thank you as always for joining us. We'll see you next week.